You're listening to WPKN 89.5 FM in Bridgeport and streaming online at wpkn.org. Reporting and supporting what matters, this is CT Examiner Weekly.
President Donald Trump was the keynote speaker at the Coast Guard Academy's commencement in New London recently, delivering a nearly hour-long speech in the blistering midday heat. It was the president's first time visiting the state in his second term, coming right after his Justice Department launched two separate legal efforts against the state. I'm reporter Luke Feeney with the story.
I'm Eric Obernauer. From hallway fights to other forms of school violence, many teachers say student misbehavior and disruption are out of control. We'll discuss why many teachers say lack of discipline is making it harder than ever for them to maintain order and do what they were trained to do: teach.
Amtrak is finally beginning a 2-year study with huge implications for Connecticut and Rhode Island. The rail service wants to determine the best place to locate a high-speed rail line connecting New Haven and Providence. But who really wants it? Several communities don't. I'm Nick Sambides, and I'll be discussing that story.
And I'm your host, Brian Scott Smith, and joining me and our reporters is Greg Stroud, editor-in-chief, and our arts editor, Robin Breeding. Welcome to you all. Each year, the Coast Guard Academy has a high-level keynote speaker for their commencement exercise. This year, it was President Trump. It's his second time being the commencement speaker, and he was met with protests outside the Coast Guard Academy campus. And in blistering heat, he delivered a nearly hour-long speech, often going off-topic. Our reporter Luke Feeney was at the commencement event and joins us in the studio to talk us through it. Luke.
So yeah, like you said, it was nearly an hour-long speech that he said was supposed to be a 20-minute speech where he wished the graduates and cadets well. And I can say, as someone who was there, the heat was miserable. I was sweating bullets the entire time.
I understand also there's a lot of people in the stands as well, required medical treatment. Greg.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the national stories we have right now is the health of President Donald Trump. So we have one of the oldest presidents in history. And so he's been to the doctors many times. But what did you see at commencement? What did you make of Donald Trump, the man?
I was impressed by how long he was able to speak. I don't know if he had fans at his feet or anything like that to help cool him down, but from what I saw, he had no protection on the direct sunlight coming down on him. And it was extremely hot. Like, I would go out of the media section for 5 minutes to get a photo, and you would think I just ran a 5K. Like, it really, for him to speak that long was impressive.
With Donald Trump, there's always the feeling that he's kind of free associating when he's standing there. What was your impression of the speech that he gave?
I think it was a sort of just classic Trump speech. I think he's been doing speeches like this for 10 years. I don't really think there was anything new. I think the thing that I found most interesting was honestly not even his speech. It was more the response to it from Democratic lawmakers. Just a few days before he gave a speech, there was a Times Siena poll that showed he was at historic unpopularity. They cited specifically his failure to bring down costs and his dealing with the war in Iran. And during his speech, he bragged about the strength he felt he had gained around the world. And I thought that juxtaposition was interesting. I also thought it was interesting how muted a lot of Connecticut Democrats were. The only Connecticut Democrat who really went on the record with me was Anthony Nolan, who represents New London in the State House. Aside from that, we reached out to the New London mayor. We reached out to Representative Joe Courtney's office, who did put out a press statement about the commencement, but didn't address Donald Trump at all. So that I found to be interesting.
Robin.
I think the importance of the Coast Guard to the economy of the area is really important. And I'm sure a lot of people were not willing to speak out because of that.
Yeah, it creates this interesting tension where you may dislike the guy as much as you want, but when he's in charge of millions of dollars in investment in the area, I understand the hesitancy to maybe not take a crack at him.
Eric.
Did he announce any new policy initiatives or hinted any? And was there any point where they just cheered or booed, for that matter, at any particular announcement?
There were no real boos during either his speech from the cadets or the crowd, which I'm not like stunned by. It's a military academy. You usually expect maybe a higher reverence for government
True.
offices there than, say, your traditional liberal arts school. That being said, I think the most popular he was with the crowd was when he was hyping up the students. And even Nolan, who disagreed with a lot of what he said he actually appreciated that part. In terms of new policies, it was really more just, he was really more highlighting previous things he did. He highlighted the billions that the Coast Guard received in the Big Beautiful Bill. He actually didn't talk about the museum at all, which was interesting, but he did talk about a lot of upcoming upgrades. He spoke about military equipment that the Coast Guard can go out and buy now. He also bragged about the executive order he signed during his first term that allowed student athletes who are at service academies to go straight into professional sports, not have to immediately enlist, as he was hyping up some of the school athletes.
Greg?
I think what you've seen is that historically, the Coast Guard has always been the sort of ugly stepchild of the military. And this is the first presidency that's really focused on the Coast Guard. And, one of the big announcements was a one-time $20 billion infusion of cash into the Coast Guard. And how that money will be spent, we don't know exactly. But I mean, we see things that the Coast Guard does differently than other branches. And one is borders, which has become, a political hot button, but that's certainly something for Trump. The other is they have a whole setup that's focused on the far north and the Arctic. And one of the announcements was a whole lot of icebreakers. So those issues, I think what's interesting, this is the second time he's appeared for an area that does have big investments in the military and the Coast Guard's and EB. Trump and his favor and the money coming out of Congress is just massive for southeastern Connecticut.
Robin?
I was just curious if they talked at all about any of the wind projects. Of course, that's been a real bone of contention there. And I was curious if he addressed that because it's been a problem.
When you say they, you're talking about the president?
Yes.
He did not talk about wind-powered projects during the speech.
Okay.
He stuck to, I actually watched it on a live stream, and he stuck to, despite obviously him going off topic, which of course is standard for him anyway. I mean, there's nothing unusual about President Trump going off topic. And even the off topic stuff was, of course, relevant, maybe not necessarily to the Coast Guard, but it was relevant to the news cycle. So of course he's going to take that opportunity. And I will just say, whether you like him or you don't, he's not the only keynote speaker that has appeared at the Coast Guard who goes off topic. But when you actually analyze it at the end of the day, I don't think there was anything unusual about it other than, yes, it was longer for the people who were sat there. I'm sure, the ones who got very hot and ended up having to have medical attention, that was an issue for them. But frankly, it wasn't anything that we didn't really expect from him. Luke, ever so many thanks. It was a very interesting, obviously, commencement, the 145th commencement for the US Coast Guard. And as you said, a very hot day, but some great reporting. Thank you for that. Our next story involves violence in our schools. Two West Hill High School sophomores, both girls, are facing charges after a late morning fight in a school hallway that led to teens' arrest and sent one of them to the hospital. It's just one of many violent clashes in our schools, and our reporter, Eric Obernauer, joins us in the studio to talk us through this more. Eric.
Yeah, well, this recent incident where this hallway fight or brawl in Stamford that you just mentioned was just the latest in a number of incidents that have been reported at this one school. Just within the same month, a student brought a taser-style stun gun and used it on 3 other students. That student is also facing charges and possible, I was led to understand, even expulsion is a possibility. I think what's shocking about the kinds of violence we're seeing, and not, in fairness, it's not just this one school. I mean, this is also one of the largest high schools in Connecticut. So just by its sheer size, you're going to have more incidents. But the brazenness of some of the types of violence we're seeing, aside from the sheer numbers of incidents, I don't think we've seen it to this degree. Again, with this, just so brazenly in the open, students getting access to these kinds of weapons That I think is new, and it's somewhat scary.
Greg, comment.
So is there a sense, Eric, of what's driving this violence? Is there, I mean, I've heard some concerns that there's some ethnic tension in the schools. I know that there's a lot of dislocation and craziness after COVID. I've heard from teachers that say students are just kind of wandering around the hallway unattended, and that naturally this is going to lead to problems. So what are you hearing?
Well, I mean, for a couple of years after COVID, I mean, we could say, yes, maybe that had something to do with it. But one thing I can very confidently say, if you talk to almost any teacher nowadays, from urban to suburban to rural, ethnically diverse or homogeneous, some aspect of violence, lack of discipline, disorder is the number one concern of educators today. And what's interesting, this is an area where I think there's a clear divide between those who are in the trenches, so to speak, actually teaching, and those who are at the top running the system. Because if you talk to administrators, they don't seem to think it's that big a deal, but teachers do. And I've wondered for some time, why are the unions not having a more active voice about this? I think that's starting to change. I think they're starting to do it. I'm starting to hear some real concerns from the union leaders.
Luke.
Eric, you say that there's a lack of discipline. I was wondering if you could elaborate on that. How can teachers not discipline kids now compared to, say, 10, 15 years ago?
Well, part of it is, there's many reasons. First of all, teachers largely have their hands tied, to be that's part of it right there. Part of it also, there's a reluctance on the part of schools to suspend students, to impose certain kinds of discipline at the very same time that, like happened in Stanford recently, where they're able to order a taser right off the internet, apparently. Because schools are reluctant to discipline students or to suspend students, increasingly, and again, it's a complaint I hear from teachers all the time, administrators are just, they're putting the problem back on teachers and in effect saying, you deal with it.
There's a conversation that's going on across the United States. It's going on. I've heard it in Middletown. I've heard it in Stanford. I've heard it in New London, where there's a real conversation about whether poor students, whether Black students, whether Latino students are more likely to be suspended. And so I think that there's a reluctance. This is a hot potato that no school administrator, no teacher wants to handle, but it makes it certainly, I think it makes everyone a little bit reluctant to suspend students, particularly out of school. Like there are also in school suspensions that have been implemented, but I think there has been a move away, would you say, away from out of school suspensions?
Yes.
And that has pluses and minuses, but one is the question of whether or not teachers can keep discipline in their classrooms.
Yes. I mean, that's true. Out of school suspensions now, my understanding is are pretty rare, and usually only in extreme circumstances. And what you said about the concern about disparate impact of suspensions on poor students, minority students, that is in the background to this. That's certainly part of it. But again, as one teacher said to me, from Stanford, that look, when you have a student who says words that I won't say on the air to a teacher with 4 letters and goes on a tirade cursing out a teacher, and that student is back in the classroom 20 minutes later, that is undermining a teacher's authority. And at what point do we say, well, look, I mean, yes, we can have these kinds of esoteric discussions, but we have to draw a line somewhere. The rationale is that every student has a legal right to an education, but there's a saying that when a clown moves into a palace, he doesn't become a king. The palace just becomes a circus. And when you have a student who's a chronic problem in terms of making trouble and just being disruptive, that student is not going to be educated. That student is going to end up disrupting the education of the other students.
Luke, final comment, and then we need to move on.
And Eric, do you think there's maybe like a disconnect how literally just one problematic kid can throw a complete class off between the teachers who experience that and the administrators in the community who aren't experienced that? Do you think they maybe don't realize just how much one bad apple can ruin the bunch?
I definitely do. And most administrators are well intended, but a lot of them have not been in the classroom or taught in the classroom in decades in some cases. I've often said, and teachers seem to like this suggestion, that every administrator should be required to still do some teaching so they don't lose that connection with the classroom.
Eric, great reporting. Thank you ever so much. And a story that we will no doubt return to, because it is something that, as you say, is not just in one particular area of the state, but is a broader issue. And our final story today is about transportation and plans for fast rail in the state. Amtrak has the go-ahead to move forward with a long-awaited 2-year study to decide how best to achieve high-speed rail service linking New Haven and Providence on the Northeast Corridor. Rail officials called it a fresh approach to a project that once sparked widespread opposition in southeastern Connecticut and southern Rhode Island. Our reporter, Nick Sambides, is in the studio with us to talk more about this story. Nick.
One of the things that's striking about this issue is that it seems like everybody wants high-speed rail someplace, but nobody really seems to want it going through their towns. It's a very difficult project to have happen, because there isn't a lot of coastal room for rail service. And moving it inland creates a whole bunch of other problems by itself. And I think earlier efforts to get this started were thwarted by miscommunication or inconsistent communication between the rail authorities and federal and state governments and the residents of these towns.
Nick, talk to us about the fact that obviously this is Amtrak, the national carrier. Of course, just recently they launched their Acela 2.0, which is the faster Acela trains. But of course, these trains can't do any faster routes because of the rail problem. So I'm guessing Amtrak really wants to, get this moving, because they've invested a lot of money in these new trains, like multi-millions.
Yeah, there's been a great deal of investment, but also the thing is, if rail service is really going to compete with the rest of the world, with the rest of the country, the speeds at which these trains move have to increase dramatically. And it's a very difficult thing to do going through suburban and urban areas that were not built with these things in mind.
Greg?
I mean, we have it's roughly most of the Northeast Corridor was built around the American Civil War. So Connecticut is the most difficult part of the Northeast Corridor because we have curves, we have at-grade crossings, it's densely built around it. So it's kind of hard to fix. It's hard to make trains go faster when you've got these sharp curves through southeastern Connecticut. So you realize there is a problem. And I mean, what we saw, though, is in 2017, 2016, more people in the town of Old Lyme commented on this project, on these solutions, than New York City and Boston and Philadelphia combined. And that's a town of 9,000 people. So people care in this area, and they care in part because the impacts from some of these rail proposals were stunning, frankly. 40 in the town where we are, there would be a 40-foot high track level running through the historic district, just a few hundred feet from where we're recording this audio.
Robin?
I'd just like to say that I remember, if I'm correct, that even if they tried to run high-speed rail, what they would be accomplishing because of these curves is a savings of 15 minutes. So I want to say exactly how does high-speed rail, there is no way to get, unless you're in China and you can draw a straight line, there's no way to get high-speed rail. They're saving 15 minutes.
Yeah, it's a really problematic thing in Connecticut because, you've also got, a profusion of air service. I mean, you've got Tweed, New Haven, you've got Bradley, you've got all these places where flying is cheaper and easier, and it's built, and the region's built for it. So it's a really difficult thing to see this work and see this move forward. That said, this is a process that's going to take 2 years, and it's a process that will probably take decades to play itself out entirely. So whatever they do, they're not going to do it quickly.
So trying to get people to agree to this huge project is another difficult thing as well, because, you can literally drive from one side of the state in a couple of hours. This isn't Texas where something like this would be beneficial. So again, there's all these issues,
definitely.
as well.
One of the things that's striking is like New London, for example, they just don't want it. They have a sea of trains running through them right now. None of them stop in New London. So you have the problem of administering or helping Amtrak or whomever to administer these rail lines. And where's the benefit for a place like that? Where's the benefit for an Old Saybrook?
Okay.
Part of the problem in Connecticut is that high-speed rail runs from dense urban centers to dense urban centers. There are no dense urban centers in Connecticut.
Right.
So the Northeast Corridor is a cooperative between all these states, but Connecticut is the state that has the most impact and the least benefit. So it's there, a lot of people, a lot of stops in New York City, in Boston, in Philadelphia, in Baltimore, in Washington, D.C. But in Connecticut, they say, well, we'll stop in New Haven. But for how many people? And yet the biggest impacts from all of these plants, the number one impacts would be in southeastern Connecticut and southern Rhode Island.
Luke.
Nick, you mentioned that a lot of communities were against it, but I'm curious. Anyone who's lived in Connecticut for any amount of time will tell you that driving on highways suck. There's so much traffic all the time. So we do have a congestion problem. Do they maybe want alternative methods for transportation, or was it really just opposition to this project?
That's a big part of it as well. Everybody wants to solve Connecticut's traffic problems, but you're kind of buying a whole set of new problems in exchange for an old set of problems. And that's a big part of the idea behind it. But in terms of solving Connecticut's congestion problems, there isn't much congruence there, because in Connecticut cases, you're traveling locally.
Yeah.
And if you want to take the train to New York, you can, or to Boston, you certainly can.
When you take the train locally or regionally, in Connecticut, most people ride by commuter rail. And that was one of the points that the New London mayor, Mike Passero, brought out. He said, we're all for rail, but we'd like more commuter rail. And we'd like to open up the Northeast Corridor with whatever plans to that commuter traffic. And so maybe we could get some of this high-speed rail off of the existing corridor so we could free that up. And those are most people in Connecticut who are on 95, I think the average drive is 15 miles. So that high-speed rail isn't going to happen. You'll drive 15 miles to get to the station to take the high-speed rail.
I think for this to work, what Amtrak and other people have to do is say how this fits into the distant future, because the present situation, it almost doesn't apply to. It's going to cost millions, if not billions of dollars to put in this rail line. It's going to take decades to build. So we're really talking, it's almost the economic and political version of science fiction.
Great reporting on that. Thank you for that, Nick. Let's turn to Robin now as we take a look at events happening in and around the state. Robin, what have you got for us this week?
I've got a pretty art-heavy schedule coming up, which is great. I'm going to start out with an out-of-town event because it's at Mass MoCA. And if you haven't been to Mass MoCA in North Adams, it's one of the best, contemporary art museums. And right now it's got a show by Cecilia Vicuna, who is one of my favorite artists. The show's called Spatial Poems, and it runs now through April in 2027. And basically she works with materials, very non-traditional materials. It could be scraps of anything. And she does what's called or considered spatial poetry. So she may put pieces together that almost feel like a musical score or a poem. And it's just some of my favorite work.
Yeah, it's interesting looking at the research that you provided on this. and some photographs. It is a visual fest completely. I mean, these large installations hanging from the ceiling. I know the listeners can't see this, but it does look incredible. And I get your point about this whole storytelling thing as well, because just the one photograph I'm looking at, and you can read so much into that as well.
Yeah, and the show is also bringing together the curators and 2 other artists who are responding to this precarious piece of vicuñas, and that's how they're shaping this entire installation.
There just aren't that many places in the world where you can see, you could call it industrial scale art. I mean, these are massive installations. And so if you're in New England and you haven't been to Mass MoCA, you can see something right there in North Adams that you're not going to find almost any place else on earth. And that it's something special. And these artists are, they're even on small scale, they would be worth seeing. But at Mass MoCA, something totally different.
Yeah, wonderful.
Absolutely. And just again, that's on now until April 4th, 2027. So you've got plenty of time to go and see it. And also just go around North Adams as well. Quaint college town as well to visit. So that will be a good day out. What have you got for us?
Next up, I'm going to give a shout out to the Center for Contemporary Printmaking in Norwalk. They have the 10th Biennial Footprint International Exhibition. And that's a show that is printmakers from all over the world doing 1 foot by 1 foot pieces. And it's a juried show. The Norwalk, the Contemporary Center is really one of the very few places that has printmaking on a really sophisticated scale. They do a lot of shows and programs, and it's a nice museum.
We've seen printmaking this is an art that we've seen dying out to some extent over the last 30, 40 years. And to see it in person and to see it in Norwalk, that one seems like a good one to go to.
Yeah.
And it says here as well that it challenges the artist because of the precise dimensions of just 12 inches by 12 inches. So it challenges them to create compelling and original works that push the boundaries of printmaking. Sounds excellent. June 7th to August the 30th at the Centre for Contemporary Printmaking down in Norwalk.
All right, next up at the Bruce Museum in Greenwich is a very intimate little show, and it is called Your Plate Squared. And what I like about this is it's people from the town making work based on America's history of picnics, cookouts, Thanksgiving, Memorial Day, Juneteenth, all these things. And they're making paintings or drawings of food that you might bring to one of these events. And it's a local show, so people are bringing their dishes to the Bruce Museum.
You've managed to squeeze in your 2 favorite things, which is art and food.
You got it.
And this is a case where the Bruce Museum is one of these lovely little jewels. They've had they've renovated the museum, a huge renovation, and it's embedded in the community more than most museums. So to see something sort of community based in this community space, I think it's kind of fitting.
And you can get some ideas of what to take to a cookout as well by visiting the exhibition. What else have you got for us?
All right. This is a little strange. On Saturday, June 13th at Foolproof Brewing Company in Bridgeport, there's an antique dealer called Ryan Matthew Cohn, and he has a shop in Bridgeport called Curated. And if you're interested in what might be called a Kunstkamera, which is the collection of oddities, well, he's your man. And so, he might have Victorian doctors' instruments to measure cranial space, or if you're interested in a pair of taxidermied lamps, he's your guy. So there's going to be a flea market at this Foolproof Brewing Company where he's bringing a lot of really weird stuff. And I think it sounds fun.
Apparently it's the first ever in Connecticut as well.
I think he's more of a specialist, you might call. He's like Peter the Great collected the skin of his favorite
his best friend,
and he had it's more like that kind of thing. They're also going to have live spirit photography at this show.
As you say, very interesting to see. That brings us to the end of this edition. My thanks as usual to Greg, Robin, Nick, Luke and Eric. Don't forget to check out the digital pages of ctexaminer.com for more stories and our events calendar for all the latest local happenings. And while you're there, why not subscribe to make sure you don't miss out on all the week's news? It's just $20 for the year. This is CT Examiner Weekly, reporting and supporting what matters. I'm Brian Scott Smith. Thank you for listening.